Hello Year 11, here is your fourth tutor session and today's focus is on narrative writing. So, just like last week's session, I'm going to go through the mark scheme with you, but specifically for narrative writing, and you will understand some of the key words of the mark scheme. And again, you will have made some notes using your tutor time revision booklet. So make sure you've got that at hand, please, and the example student work that is in the other booklet that you've been given. So, a quick point to note is narrative writing is about a sequence of events, so it is a short story. Unlike a description, your narrative writing is expected to have a clear beginning, middle and end. Now that doesn't need to be an epic story. It doesn't need to have loads of characters and loads of events, but it does need to have a distinctive start, middle and end. So that is something you need to plan for. And again, I'll say it again, the mantra is clear, planning is key. Your narrative writing still needs to employ some descriptive writing. So this is where I think there is a little bit of confusion, but your description should have minimal narrative. It should just be description, but your narrative can have description in it because, of course, you're going to be describing things like the atmosphere, the characters and the places and the setting. So it doesn't need to be an epic. You need to keep it simple with subtle and imaginative details. So just like last week, you have got the mark scheme printed for you. So if you go to the section that says session 4, language paper 1, question 5, narrative writing, we're looking at the left-hand side of the mark scheme. Just like last week, you've got the 4 levels going from simple and basic right up to where your writing is distinctive and convincing. And just like last week, I will go through some hints and tips and sort of secret things that the examiners recommend to make sure that your narrative is successful. So, the main points of the mark scheme then. So all of the bullet points, hopefully this was sort of clear, maybe not explicit last week, but I'll make it a bit more explicit this week. The bullet points of each level are all based around the same things, but it's the thoroughness or how convincing you are that puts you into the different band. So the main things we're focusing on are the narrative voice that you create, the character or the characters, the setting, the pace of your writing, any shifts in time and place, the mood that you create, the sequence of events, dialogue, and then the conclusion. Those are as they are in order on the mark scheme, but as I talk through them, I'm going to group some of them together so that they are a little bit more, because they go together well, to be honest. So let's get started. So as we can see from the bottom of the mark scheme, the key adjectives there are simple, basic, limited, simple, basic, few and limited. So it goes without saying that we want to avoid that. And as I said last week, you are all capable of more than that. Level 3 is always about being clear and how things are developed, how you've made those good choices. But if we're really aiming for that band 4, we're looking at things that are distinctive, so they stand out. It's convincing. We actually believe in your character. You've not just created this character called Bob. There's detail to your description of your setting. That funny word, judicious, comes up again, just like it does in the literature exam, and that just means really well chosen. So well chosen control of pace. I will explain to you what temporal and spatial means. Subtle shifts in mood with imaginative sequence of events. So again, just like the descriptive writing, it's about those little unseen or very sort of hard to notice things that you bring to life. Dialogue that enhances characterisation and convincing conclusion. So I'll take you through those a bit more specifically now. So to start off with then, you do need to make some choices for your story. Are you going to write with a first person narrative voice, so using I, or are you going to go with a more omniscient, which means all-knowing, third person narrative voice? Either is fine. Obviously a first person narrative tends to be a character that is involved in the story, so it might be more like a personal event that is being shared, and that possibly is a little bit easier. It's more like you're writing a diary entry, I suppose, sort of a reflection on an event that's happened, or a third person is fine as well. Obviously, they can stand away from the action and comment on everything as is known. If you're aiming for that top band and it's a distinctive narrative voice, you want to try and create a sense of voice. So how do you make sure that your character, or the narrator has something that's distinctive? So if we think about A Christmas Carol, the narrator of A Christmas Carol is quite distinctive because they break out of describing the action and they talk directly to the reader. And that's something that you could do. So don't forget, you can use ideas that you've learnt from the literature exam or from any past papers that we've looked at. So if you've looked at the Alex Cold paper, that is a third person narrative telling us all about Alex and how he's scared about his mother dying or being poorly, the relationship with him and his family. But we then get an insight into Alex's mind through the description from the third person narrator. So really, it's about choice. You need to make that choice. And in order to have a distinctive narrative voice, how does your narrator come across? Do they comment on the action? Are they breaking out of the action and description to talk to you, talk to us as the reader? Make those little choices. Okay, so for top band, you want a convincing character. For any narrative, you need characters. The difference between level 2 and level 4 is one-dimensional characters to convincing. So a convincing character is one that you can actually believe in, so they actually feel like a real human being. Try not to create these sort of cliched stereotypes of, a boy called Bob or a man called Bob. I think that's the most unoriginal idea ever. So think about actual humans, base them on people that you know or characters that you've seen in films, so that you can actually bring them to life. They've got mannerisms, they've got thoughts and feelings that are realistic, they've got actions, the way they move, the way they speak. All of those things are convincing. So think about how you describe how they speak. So do they speak with a dark gravelly voice or a high-pitched squeal? All of those just make the reader imagine the character a bit more. Definitely include dialogue in your narrative writing. It doesn't need to be loads, but you can have some snippets of dialogue, and you can actually include that in your descriptive writing as well. And where we say it enhances characterisation, the dialogue really should give your characters a voice. So think about the words that they use. One example that I saw as part of the course that I went on was where the dialogue was written so that you could hear the accent or hear the way they spoke. So if you think about how you might use clipped words, or you might write within the dialogue, we're gonna go here, and you would write it as gonna. Now that wouldn't be you using slang, but you'd be using slang as part of the dialogue, which enhances the characterisation if your character is maybe a teenager or in an informal situation. Obviously you can't swear in it, so avoid that, but the dialogue really, to enhance the character, should help bring the character to life a little bit more. You might also spell certain words phonetically, which means as they sound, so that you get a stronger sense of accent. You might remember, I know we haven't done all of the poems, but way back in year 9 when we did Checking Out My History, or right at the beginning of year 9 or 8 when you did Half Caste and John Agard wrote the words so that you could hear his accent, doing that within your dialogue, and that is used well within the exemplar that is in your pack. Okay, so this is setting, is where you can get your descriptive writing techniques into your narrative writing, and setting the scene at the start or within the first few paragraphs of your narrative is key. So every time you have a location or a place or a building or a landscape, describe it just like you would do in a descriptive piece of writing. Often narratives that we either read in the reading section or that you have read as part of your practice have set the scene at the beginning. So setting can be, as I've said, landscape, buildings, places, and it can be including the weather. So that's a way for you to get in your pathetic fallacy. So the weather and the atmosphere. Again, as part of your planning, think about your setting, and then think about how your setting or settings or atmosphere might change over the course of the narrative. Oh, there's a little typo there, sorry. So sequence of events links to what I've just said about planning. So you can think about how, like what order is your narrative going in? Are you starting at the end and then flashing back? Are you just going in a chronological order? How are you getting from A to B to C within your story? So plan out what is going into your 5 or 6 paragraphs, and obviously we're aiming for at least 5 paragraphs for a narrative. The sequence of events needs to be imaginative, so I would strongly suggest that you try to either employ a flashback or you make your story cyclical. By doing that, so by echoing the start and the end, it shows the examiner that you've really carefully planned your writing. Okay, so the mark scheme, as you'll see in the 5th bullet point down, says the words temporal and spatial, which are just really poncy words, really. Temporal is anything to do with time, and spatial is to do with space or place. So we're really just thinking about how you shift between time, whether that's a normal chronological order of events, sort of today, later that day, now, or a few moments later, or yesterday, a few weeks ago. And you can do that by including a flashback or a flash forward. Organising your paragraphs and starting your sentences with those temporal markers, those time connectives basically, is a really clear way to show your examiner or the examiner that you've thought about your temporal shifts. Spatial is about showing the place or the relation between two things. So those are typically to do with your prepositions. The main prepositions are by, for, in, at and on. So think about where things are near or what things are by other things. Or is it in relation to something? Is it inside something? Is it in the corner? Is it on top of? Is it at the side? So if you think about the position of things, you can then begin to think about your spatial shifts. But also think bigger than that. Think about the places and the settings of your narrative. Where does it start? Where does it shift to? And where does it end? And again, you're asking yourself, like, what position am I positioning my reader in? Or what setting have I got? How am I going to describe that? Why is it there? And then why am I changing it? Again, think back to stories and narratives that you have read. So the sequence of events in An Inspector Calls is chronological. We get references to sort of flashbacks. We get movement in time in A Christmas Carol. If you read the Jamaica Inn extract, that was again chronological, but it started with setting. It then moved and zoomed in to focus on the horse and the driver, and then inside the cab, and then back out to the weather, and then back inside the cab to focus on the characters in more detail. The Alex Cold extract started with Alex in his bedroom. It sort of flashed back to the nightmare, then it shifted downstairs into the kitchen and a focus on his family, and then it shifted to sort of, again, a memory for Alex. So all of those shifts, it's just like the structure question which is question 3 of paper 1. You are now making sure that you plan the structure of your writing. There's that funny word again, judicious control of pace. So a really careful control of pace. And I know that this is one of the questions I've posed for you in your booklet. So how can you control pace? Well, that is through your paragraphing. How are you going to organise your paragraphs so that your reader is guided through your story? But another way to control pace is through punctuation and sentences. So having that careful punctuation to demarcate your sentences so that the reader knows when to stop, pause, breathe and move on. Long, complex sentences with lots of clauses and lots of detail can sort of carry your reader along and carry your reader away, and then you can make them sort of stop abruptly with a short, snappy sentence. Sounds obvious, but that control is through a range of sentence lengths and sentence structures. That is how you control pace. When you look at the example of the narrative that is in your other pack, you will notice that the pace of that story isn't particularly good. So you might want to think about how you could make that pace better. How could you slow it down? How could you draw the reader in a bit more? Then how could you speed it up towards the end to bring it to a good conclusion? Shifts in mood. So again, with planning, you can think about how you establish a mood or an atmosphere. How would that then shift? And then how does it end? I always think of a story as being in 3 parts, but having a clear shift in mood will also show the examiner that you've got that juxtaposition in place. So make sure that you plan for that if you're aiming for the top band. There needs to be a shift in mood. It doesn't need to be a dramatic shift. It could just be a subtle shift, but how can you show that? And finally, there needs to be a convincing conclusion. If you don't end your story, you're not going to get into the top band. And again, the story, as I've said, doesn't need to be an epic story, but it does need a clear ending. Whether that ending is a cliffhanger or not, doesn't matter. But there needs to be a sense that you have chosen to end your story there. And as we've tried to encourage you to do, ending your story maybe with a repetition of a phrase or part of a repeat of a phrase from your first line is a really good way to show that you have structured and ended your story well. So it's time for you to have a little look now at the story written by student A. It's called Abandoned. So it was a response to the title Abandoned. It is a clear narrative. It does have a beginning, a middle and an end. However, it's not the most convincing. So we would place that in band 2. So have a little look at it and look at how the narrative voice is just emerging. Look at how the character is quite one-dimensional. It's quite stereotypical. It sort of does everything that a narrative should do. It's got clear structure, clear events. It's got dialogue. It's quite pacey. But is it actually believable? So it's been put into level 2 because I'm looking at the mark scheme, so I want you to have a look at level 2, please. Because it does have an occasional sense of place, but the places aren't described so that you can really imagine them. The characters are quite standard. It has some implausible events, so where the character, where the narrator introduces another character, it's quite obvious, it's quite stereotypical. The dialogue, there is some use of it, but it's not particularly believable. And that's what plausible means. And the ending is abrupt and it's contrived. So have a little look at that and then have a discussion with your partner or a peer to sort of see how you could improve it. There'll be a follow-up YouTube clip on our channel with some comments about how we think you could improve it. So check that out if you want to. Thanks a lot, Year 11.